Well, as Ottawa prepares to celebrate the first Canada Day in 3 years without COVID-19 restrictions, police are focusing on preventing a repeat of the chaos we saw this past winter in Ottawa. Some of those same convoy protesters have vowed to return to the city on Friday, and with growing concern about what that might bring, authorities are on edge. Case in point, a judge who presided over the Freedom Convoy hearings has now told CBC News of threats against them, serious enough to warrant police protection. We are withholding the judge's identity to protect their personal safety. But let's try to understand, if we could, how this convoy has changed since last winter's occupation and what, if any, kind of security risk might be posed now. Justin Ling is a freelance investigative journalist who's been following not just this story, but the group's movements and conversations online very closely. Joining us from Montreal tonight. Hi, Justin.
Hey, good evening, Andrew.
Hey, so before we get to Canada Day specifically, my first question is about the size of this group, because it can be often hard to discern how big or how small the group or the movement actually is. What's your sense of that?
I mean, Liz, this is a sizable movement. We saw upwards of 10,000 people who came out to Ottawa, probably more than 10,000 others who came to solidarity rallies, who came along the route to wish them well, tens of thousands of people who donated to Kickstarters and crowdfunders, hundreds of thousands who follow some of the social media pages and groups and whatnot. So this is a sizable movement. I think we are talking six figures here, and I think it's only grown since the original so-called Freedom Convoy in January and February. They have, I think, exploded in size. So this is a sizable movement. This is nothing to be kind of brushed off.
So that being said, what are your expectations for this weekend, for this Friday, for Canada Day? Would we see a repeat of what happened during the winter at all? Is that a possibility?
Unless these folks have a huge surprise cooked up, I don't anticipate anything near the scope and size of the occupation you saw in January and February. The organizers of the events around Canada Day are saying explicitly there is no convoy, there is no occupation, there's not even a protest. They're planning a march from a park in Ottawa to the National War Memorial. They're following a guy named James Topp. He's a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces who has marched from Vancouver to Ottawa in protest of vaccine mandates. And everything is sort of organized around him. This is not the culmination of their events this summer. This is the start of what they're calling, a Freedom Summer, a series of events that are going to go on straight into the fall. So this is not the main event. So I don't anticipate anything massive. That being said, there's a smaller contingent, admittedly a more radical contingent, that are talking about basically occupying the grounds of a courthouse with a plan to force the arrest of the Prime Minister and the premiers, which is absolutely ludicrous, that I know police are concerned about, but we have no sense of how big that could be. They're claiming 5,000 people are going to show up. I don't think there's any chance it's going to be that many. But nevertheless, that is something to watch, because that is something that could actually pose a real challenge for law enforcement if it goes through as planned. Right,
because one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and this is with reference to either of the two groups you just mentioned, what do they want? I mean, if there may not be an explicit protest, but what is it that they're hoping to see change?
Yeah, so this was never explicitly about vaccine mandates. We've been saying this for months now. The main group, which has kind of formed into a kind of a loose-knit coalition of various organizations, yes, is against vaccine mandates. But increasingly, they're using their political muscle to advocate against vaccines for COVID-19 in general. They've been meeting with MPs, more than a dozen MPs in recent weeks. And it seems like they're interested in kind of going mainstream, going legit, exercising their influence over the Conservative Party in particular. Now, this other contingent, like I said, is more radical. They're done with peaceful protests. They've said so explicitly. We don't have a sense of how big that part is, but they've made it very clear that they want vaccines basically discouraged. They want everyone who encouraged vaccines arrested, put on trial, and put in jail. So that contingent is much harder to gauge. It's much harder to deal with. And I know the police are worried they could be a legitimate threat to national security.
Justin Ling, very good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.